So as people are writing, one thing I wanted to, now that we're in the middle of our talks, right? I hope everybody is seeing lots of, synergies and like consistencies across contexts. So I'm curious about, well, maybe this is just an open-ended question for you. Like, how are you seeing like, you know, what the types of interventions that you're advocating that you would like to advocate for, right? So there's some that are, we think about how these negative ideologies are really seen in policy. That's like something that's come up over and over again. And then there's also the really insightful comment you had about let's not, shy away from the fact that we are experiencing race and language together. Let's not, do color blind racism, basically. And so that's at a different sort of, location that intervention is. So I'm curious if you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I don't know if I have a coherent answer for that, but like like just going back to like language itself, like there's a lot of discussion about DEI in the news, right? Especially in the US, right? Demonization of DEI. But when we talk about DEI, like oftentimes language is treated as separately from all of these diversity inclusion policies. So I find that language is often treated as a sort of technical skill to master, right, is perceived as something that's an exception. So like, oh yeah, we're against racism, but people need to speak the standard to get a job, to do well academically. So I think um, it's conceptually easy to separate language, but that's not how language works. Language is embodied, it's embedded within all of these other axes of social differentiation. So I think there's a lot of work to actually sort of still acknowledge that language has to be in the same analytical field when we're addressing all of these other types of oppressions. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of work to do.
So we have a question that I will read. I'm interested in the question of how to hold institutions accountable beyond accreditation. Are there policy guidelines or best practices, recommendations that could be implemented? I feel like threatening them with disaccreditation is kind of like a nuclear option.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a good question. Um, Yeah, I'm sort of hesitant to talk about like so-called best practices because I think each institution it's very much contextual. So I think you really have to work within, institutional realities and stuff like that. So yeah, so I think the recommendations that I offered on the slides are very maybe idealistic, to be honest. But yeah, I think it really goes into, actually paying attention to the context once again. I think trying to change, make any change to the status quo means recognizing, who the stakeholders are, how they're operating in particular institution. So yeah, sadly, and I don't have like specific, recommendations once again. I'm very bad at thinking off the top of my head, but I think my short answer is just think of the context basically and work from there.
Yeah, Anna follows up. This is a very present struggle for us in my institutional context with graduate student instructor approval for teaching. There's a very stringent process for students categorized as non-native.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So, and Sharon Hill says, I appreciate the examples in this talk as it brings the concepts to life and demonstrates the impact of nativeness in the workplace and educational settings. Absolutely. Um, Another question in the Q&A. Thank you, Vijay. In higher education, particularly, I find that often any discomfort around discussing the intersections between racism and language is deferred to standardized language tests, which are seen as the arbiter of readiness for study. But we know that these assessments are laced with cultural bias and nativist norms, just to start. these test scores almost invisibilize enregistrement because they're seen as, quote, objective. How might you respond to instructors or stakeholders who try to avoid conversations about race by invoking those tests?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I want to just remind everyone of Dr. Holt's previous talk, because she talked a lot about assessment as well. So if you didn't have a chance to watch it, like rewatch her talk, her amazing talk. So, I would probably echo points that she made beforehand. Um, this is a question that's interesting because in my context, I teach a lot of international students, and we have to do a lot of like spoken assessments about their pronunciation. And oftentimes we have to measure students' intelligibility, right? So for anyone who knows me, intelligibility is like, I don't perceive it as a trait, right? I perceive it as really a goal of communication. So I try to push back as much as possible in my own context to have test takers realize like their perceptions actually influence the score that they give a student, right? So it's not really about what they're doing, it's like how you're perceiving them in real time. So I think, yeah, just responding to this person's question, I think, yeah, well, what I tell my colleagues and my superiors, like we have to have training, like we have to actually interrogate how we listen to people, because listening is not a technical skill, it's very much ideological and multisensory. So the way that we perceive the test taker is going to influence how we mark them, assess them. So definitely, I think we just need more listener training, right? I think it's not about making the student assimilate, right? It's really about, trying to do our part as receivers.
Thank you. And yes, this came up in many of the conversations we've already have, and I'm sure it's going to come up again of like who has the burden, and how we rethink that and how we think about power and oppression and the ways of addressing those things. Thank you. And also Dr. Holt's discussion of, organizing, voting, like these types of sort of changing material conditions of in a particular context is also super helpful. Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. I tried to do it in Q&A, but I think I can't do it as a host for some reason. So I will ask it directly here. Thank you so much for your talk. So one of the things that your research is so relevant in the ways that people are also talking about diversity or diversifying language spaces. And one of the things that I am noticing is that there's this emphasis on either big tech companies or media outlets that, oh, we're diversifying our actors, our employees. And you get to see that racialization of identity is still embedded into those constructions. Do you have any additional readings, recommendations for us that how can we communicate with these high stakeholders that what they're doing is actually not diversifying, it's actually contributing to that systematic racism in different ways. So we're just changing the modality, but we're still continuing to do the exact same thing. I was just wondering your opinions on that.
Yeah, I feel like I can give another presentation on that because I have a lot of, because I another thing that I'm into is like critiquing accent, so-called accent reduction and all of that sorts of things. But just kind of connecting that question to what I talked about in this presentation. Going back to your point, Ethan, about like companies are diversifying, but maybe visually, right? Okay, we have Black and brown faces on our company board, or our workforce is diversified in terms of faces, but we all have to sort of communicate in a singular manner, right? So those tech companies that are changing accents in real time, like for call center workers, like you can speak in so-called Indian English and it can translate your accent into a so-called standard American voice. So you wanted like maybe like strategies or resources that we can maybe communicate to people. That's a good question. I think like you have to I think like it's good to just make your work known as well. So like sometimes, if you see like a company, like just emailing them and say, hey, I noticed you, uh, you know, you, um, you offer this service, but maybe have you ever thought that this might, be doing more harm than good? Yeah.
Yes, yes, yeah, and yeah, that's exactly the point that I want to emphasize, the more harm, right? Because visibility has been it is still a big issue in our society, but pursuing visibility without protecting minoritized communities and just basically turning them into bigger targets, right? And this is, I think, very much related to your comments on DEI initiatives and how all of a sudden there's this huge emphasis on getting rid of that entire space. I think a part of that is the lack of intersectional research and how people's understanding of diversity was actually just, let's change the name and keep the same structure and let's see how that will work, right? So yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I want to just read out a point in the chat. Dr. Ramjattan brings up a good point about the framing of language acquisition as skill acquisition, which is so prevalent in the public. It feeds into an empowerment narrative that comes up in several of these spaces: migration/citizenship, SLP, English teaching, the idea that someone can just put in the work and change their language. Yet, at the same time, the target of nativeness is impossible. And so this feels like a kind of gaslighting.
Yeah. Wholeheartedly agree.
So again, as people are maybe writing or thinking, I sort of have another question as I'm thinking about, as with all the presenters here, learned so much from everyone's work, and thinking about how these conversations are really happening in this spaces, disciplinary spaces where they are happening, the reasons why that's happening. So, you gave us some suggestions for, people who are in different disciplinary spaces than your own. And I wanted to know, because one way I've been thinking about this is, linguists are the ones who have been valorizing and sort of fetishizing nativeness. And so it's up to us to also clean up our own house in many ways. And so I'm curious, what your sort of specific, or if there's anything, to sort of that you'd like to share with people like me who are trained doing psycholinguistics and syntax.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I didn't really talk about my background. Technically I'm not like a linguist. My PhD is in adult education and community development. I specialize in workplace learning, but my previous master's degrees were in sort of language education and TESOL. So I think like the work that I do, I don't think I would be able to do it in a specific discipline. Right, like if I was in the linguistics department, I don't think I would even have a job to begin with, because like what I do has not been considered, pure linguistics. But I think, Sabi, I think you bring up like a bigger question about like the nature of disciplines, right? So why do we have disciplines in the first place? Because like, like even within the language specific disciplines, like what's so different between a sociolinguist and a linguistic anthropologist at the end of the day, right? Aren't they sort of doing similar type of work, right? So I think like we need, like going back to structural change, I think we need to sort of break down our disciplinary silos and just kind of communicate with each other and not classify different things as, okay, this is, linguistics and this is not linguistics. I think they all need to be studied simultaneously, basically. So yeah, basically burn it all down.
Yes, wonderful. We just wrote about that as one of the things that we need to do, we think. So hopefully that will be received in some way, and we'll see what that looks like. There's a question in the Q&A. I teach linguistics as well, in addition to psycholinguistics. And whenever I ask linguistic students what a parentheses ideal native speaker is for them, they usually say a professor of linguistics. I thought that is so hilarious. Yeah.
I guess it goes back to that idea of like the native speaker being imagined to be the ideal user of the language. Like they know exactly, the best way to articulate sentences and pronounce things. So yeah.
Right. So, and again, this idea of authority coming in into play that we see also in research spaces and in classroom spaces and in communities as well. Yeah. Anna Babel says, I think I also appreciated the point that the racialization of native speakerhood erases the real skills that are needed to be an effective language teacher. Part of a larger discourse around teaching as something, quote, natural or inborn rather than professional and expert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So we really see this idea also of, yeah, you know, nativeness is something that it has to happen at birth and then continue. Something has to be something that happens right then and then continues through your whole lifespan. And that there's no other way around it. Yeah. And Vishnu says speech language pathology needs a lot of cleanup too, as the professional organizations such as ASHA have accent modification explicitly in their scope of practice.
Yeah. Hi, Vishnu. Yeah. So yeah, I know Vishnu stands on this. So wholeheartedly agree. Yeah. So I could probably give another presentation on accent modification and the harms with that as well. But yeah, there's many organizations that need to clean up.
I have just a question thinking about your, work in the classroom. So one thing that led me to work on, well, lots of things, let's say, but whatever. One thing that I've encountered is when speaking with people who are, like whose language use is pathologized or otherwise marginalized, how we communicate sort of what we know as linguists and how that relates to like also their material or like to sort of how they're like their own sort of ideologies about where they're at. And so I've thought a lot about how I frame, responses to comments like, well, my Malayalam is broken, or, which just describes, maybe use of non-Dravidian words or something, right? Or that can sort of correspond to many different things. And so I'm curious, when you encounter those ideologies in the classroom setting, like, what are different ways that you address them? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a great point. Yeah, so I mostly teach, English as an additional language students who are international students. So, oftentimes, they come to the university with this deficit mentality because they usually had to do maybe TOEFL or IELTS. Like, so they had to prove that they know English to begin with. So they have that inferiority complex to begin with. But what I try to do in my everyday pedagogy is to try to show students rather than tell them. So, I rarely sort of lecture them and say, hey, you don't need to sound like a native speaker of English to be understood, right? So, through kind of the activities that we do, I try to show them, okay, it's not actually necessary to sound like a native speaker, right? When we think about research and with regard to English as a lingua franca, right? Oftentimes those native speaker accents from the global north are not always intelligible, right? For from English users in the global south, right? So, I try to sort of show them, okay, well, it's not necessary, to do that. So basically try to show them rather than lecture them, I think is a good strategy. Because a lot of times students are not interested in, exploring language ideologies. They have very instrumental goals, right? So you sort of have to balance, your own politics, but also sort of acknowledge that they're here just, for specific reasons. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, that's really a helpful point, I think, and concrete thing to sort of end on. And yes, the idea of global north varieties not being intelligible in the global south is something I encounter all the time. It's why I don't use English when I go to India, because it's like you don't talk right. So anyway, all right. So let's then thank Vijay again. And now we're ready to transition to our next presenter, Lena.